The grand piano was a black mirror, reflecting the crystal chandeliers and the indifferent faces of the wealthy. It sat on the stage like an altar in a cathedral of commerce, silent and sacred. Down below, on the marble floor of the Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala, Alara Vance felt like a ghost haunting a feast she was forbidden to touch. Her stomach was a tight, aching knot, a familiar sensation that had been her constant companion for the past 2 years. But tonight, the hunger was sharper, laced with a desperation so profound it felt like swallowing glass. She wasn't hungry for herself. The small, stale roll she had managed to snag from an unattended catering cart was tucked safely in her pocket, a precious offering for her little brother, Leo. A man in a tuxedo that cost more than her parents' first car blocked her path to the buffet. He was not one of the imposing security guards. He was something worse. He was a man drowning in borrowed authority, and he had the puffed-up chest and disdainful sneer to prove it. His name tag read, Marcus Thorne, Event Coordinator. "Can I help you?" he asked, the question a blade disguised as courtesy. His eyes did a swift, humiliating inventory of her appearance. The frayed cuffs of her oversized coat, a relic from a thrift store bin. The worn-out sneakers peeking from beneath her jeans. The way her hair, though clean, was simply tied back without an ounce of styling. She did not belong. Every fiber of his being screamed it. Alara clutched the strap of her worn backpack, the thin canvas a flimsy shield against his judgment. Inside were Leo's medical files, a chaotic symphony of terrifying terminology and crushing prognosis. I thought perhaps," she began, her voice barely a whisper, easily swallowed by the sophisticated hum of the room. Marcus leaned in, a conspiratorial smirk playing on his lips. "You thought what? That this was a soup kitchen? This is a fundraiser, my dear. $1,000 a plate. For donors. For the people who matter." He gestured vaguely toward the glittering assembly of high society. "Not for street rats looking for a handout." The slur landed like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She flinched. She had been called worse, but hearing it in this place, a place supposedly dedicated to compassion, felt like a special kind of cruelty. He saw her eyes drift toward the piano on the stage, a magnetic pull she was powerless to resist. He noticed the direction of her gaze and let out a short, derisive laugh. "Oh, I see. You're an artist, are you?" He waved a dismissive hand toward the magnificent instrument. "That's a Fazioli, sweetheart. Not a toy in a bus station. Tonight, the rule is simple." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of expensive mints and cheap power. "If you can't play, you don't eat." He thought it was a clever, cutting remark. A perfect little bon mot to dismiss the insignificant girl in front of him. He had no way of knowing that for Alara Vance, those words were not a metaphor. He had just articulated the central, tragic irony of her entire existence. She could play. Oh God, she could play. She could make that piano sing, weep, and roar. She could play passages that would make angels weep and devils bow their heads. But what good was that now? Her talent was a silent, screaming thing trapped inside her, as useless as a key to a house that had long ago burned to the ground. The weight of that uselessness pressed down on her, heavier than the hunger, heavier than the shame. All she could think about was Leo. Leo, lying in a sterile white bed in the pediatric ward of City General, his small body tethered to a chorus of beeping machines. He had his father's eyes and his mother's smile, but both were dimmed now by the relentless shadow of his illness. A rare genetic disorder was methodically shutting down his organs. There was one hope, an experimental treatment, a gene therapy so new and so astronomically expensive that it might as well have been on the moon. $250,000. The number was a monstrous, impossible joke. That was why she was here. Not to beg for food, but to beg for a life. She had spent the last week researching Alastair Sterling, the billionaire philanthropist hosting this gala. She had read that he was a self-made man who valued ingenuity and grit. She had harbored a desperate, foolish fantasy that if she could just get 5 minutes of his time, if she could tell him her story, show him Leo's files, he might understand. He might help. But getting past gatekeepers like Marcus Thorne was a challenge she hadn't adequately prepared for. Men like Marcus were the walls of the fortress, designed specifically to keep the desperate out. She clutched the faded silver locket hidden beneath her collar. It was cold against her skin, a small, solid anchor in a sea of despair. Inside was a tiny, folded picture of her parents, Julian and Isabella Vance, their faces radiant as they stood beside this very same model of Fazioli piano after a triumphant performance at Carnegie Hall. They had been titans of the classical music world, their duets legendary. They had filled their home with music, with love, with the unwavering belief that their daughter was a prodigy destined for even greater heights. Alara had been their star pupil. From the age of 4, her life had been a whirlwind of scales, arpeggios, and sonatas. She didn't just learn the music, she inhaled it. It was her native language, the architecture of her soul. She could hear the complex counterpoint in the rhythm of the rain, the harmonic overtones in a passing train whistle. By 16, she had been granted early admission to Juilliard, a scholarship secured, her future a dazzling symphony waiting to be conducted. Then the music had stopped. A patch of black ice on a winter road, a speeding truck, a phone call in the dead of night that had shattered her world into a million discordant pieces. One moment, she was a celebrated prodigy. The next, she was an orphan, responsible for her 6-year-old brother. The debts were the final, cruel surprise. Her parents, brilliant artists, had been naive investors. A trusted financial advisor had swindled them, leaving behind a mountain of liabilities disguised as assets. The house, the savings, the pianos, it was all seized. Juilliard became an impossible dream. Survival became the only composition she had time to practice. They moved from a friend's couch to a relative's spare room, and finally, when all charity had been exhausted, to a series of grim, transient shelters. Alara took any job she could find, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, stocking shelves. Her hands, once destined to grace the ivory keys of the world's most prestigious concert halls, became chapped and raw from bleach and hot water. She told herself it was a temporary measure, a brief, dissonant passage before the main theme returned. But the silence had stretched from months into years. 2 years. 2 years of protecting Leo, of shielding him from the harshest realities of their new life, of reading to him in hushed tones in crowded shelter rooms. And then, 6 months ago, Leo had started getting tired. So tired. The diagnosis came like a final, brutal crescendo, a declaration of war from a universe that had already taken everything. So now she stood here, in this palace of excess, a ghost from a different life. Marcus Thorne saw a beggar. He didn't see the girl who could play Chopin's Winter Wind, etude from memory, a piece that had made her father weep with pride. He saw filth and desperation, not the ghost of a lineage that had commanded standing ovations across continents. And his cruel, casual dismissal, "If you can't play, you don't eat," was the most profound and painful truth she had ever heard. In this world, her true worth was invisible, and therefore, it did not exist. Marcus, satisfied that he had sufficiently squashed the insect that had dared to crawl into his pristine ballroom, turned his attention elsewhere. He spotted a young waitress, no older than Alara, struggling with a heavy tray of champagne flutes. One of the glasses tilted precariously. "You," Marcus barked, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. The waitress jumped, and a few drops of champagne sloshed onto the polished floor. "Watch what you're doing, you clumsy girl. Do you have any idea how much this Persian rug costs? More than your entire family will earn in a decade." The girl's face flushed a deep, painful red. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thorne. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," he sneered, puffing out his chest. He smoothed his lapels, preening as he scanned the room for his true target, Alastair Sterling. He was a master of managing up and kicking down, a petty tyrant whose entire sense of self was derived from the terror he could inspire in those beneath him and the approval he could solicit from those above. He was a creature of the flawed system, a symptom of a corporate culture that valued sycophants over substance. The Sterling Foundation did incredible work, funding hospitals and research centers around the globe, but its daily operations, its public face, were entrusted to men like Marcus. Men who saw charity as a performance and people as props. A wave of nausea washed over Alara. This was a mistake. A complete, humiliating mistake. She needed to leave, to get back to the hospital, to sit by Leo's side and hold his hand. That was real. This glittering charade was not. She began to back away, melting into the shadows near the service corridor, when a sudden change in the room's atmosphere made her pause. The string quartet that had been providing ambient music had finished their set. A nervous-looking man in a rumpled suit was now speaking to a frantic Marcus near the stage. There were hushed, urgent tones, wild gesticulations. Alara, with her musician's ear for drama, could piece it together easily. The featured pianist, the evening's main entertainment, was a no-show, a last-minute cancellation. Marcus's face was a mask of barely controlled panic. This was his moment to shine, and the spotlight had just blown a fuse. The success of the gala, and by extension his career prospects, depended on a seamless, elegant evening. An empty stage and a silent piano were a disaster. He scrambled, whispering furiously into his headset. A moment later, a young man, barely out of his teens, was reluctantly pushed toward the piano. A backup, a conservatory student hired to play background music during dinner, not to be the headline act. The boy sat at the Fazioli, his hands trembling. He placed a sheet of music on the stand, a simplified, bland arrangement of a popular classical piece, something safe and utterly uninspired. He began to play. The notes were correct, but they were lifeless. They hung in the air like dust motes, devoid of passion or meaning. The sophisticated chatter in the room barely faltered. This was not a performance, it was noise. Alara winced. It wasn't just the boy's nervousness. The arrangement itself was flawed. A clunky, amateurish chord progression in the bridge grated on her ears like nails on a chalkboard. It was musically illiterate, an insult to the original composition. It was a small thing, a detail no one else in this room would ever notice, but to her, it was a profound offense. A new plan, reckless and desperate, began to form in her mind. It was a whisper of an idea, a flicker of the old Alara, the one who believed in the power of her gift. She watched as Marcus practically vibrated with anxiety, barking orders at his staff, his back to the stage. The young pianist finished his piece to scattered, polite applause before quickly retreating for a break, looking relieved to escape. The stage was empty. This was her chance. It was a fool's errand, a desperate gamble. But what other choice did she have? The clock was ticking, not just on the gala, but on Leo's life. She slipped from the shadows, moving with a practiced invisibility honed by years of trying not to be noticed. She navigated the periphery of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Each step was a risk. A security guard's glance, a guest's curious stare, any of it could bring her desperate mission to a halt. She reached the stage. The grand piano loomed, a magnificent beast asleep in the spotlight. Its polished surface seemed to hum with latent power. For a moment, she was paralyzed by a grief so sharp it almost brought her to her knees. It had been so long since she had touched keys like these, keys that responded with such perfect weight and precision. Her hands, calloused and scarred from menial labor, felt unworthy. But the thought of Leo, his small, trusting face, pushed her forward. She wasn't doing this for herself. She was doing it for him. She found the sheet music the young pianist had left on the stand. There it was, the clumsy arrangement, the offensive chord progression in the bridge. In her pocket, amongst Leo's papers and the stale bread roll, was a small pencil stub she used for scribbling notes. Her hands moved with an old, familiar certainty. She didn't tear the page or make a scene. She simply made a small, elegant correction. With a few swift strokes, she altered the bass clef, rewrote the harmony, transforming the jarring, awkward passage into something fluid, sophisticated, and beautiful. It was a ghost's edit, an anonymous contribution, a whisper of her former self left on the page. She slipped away as quickly as she had come, her heart pounding. She found a dark corner behind a large potted palm and watched, holding her breath. The young pianist returned to the stage, looking even more miserable than before. He sat down, glanced at the sheet music, and his brow furrowed. He noticed the pencil marks. He looked around, confused, then back at the page. He tentatively placed his fingers on the keys and played the corrected passage. The difference was immediate and undeniable. The music flowed. The harmony resolved in a way that was both surprising and deeply satisfying. A few guests, those with more discerning ears, actually stopped their conversations and looked toward the stage. The music was still played by a nervous boy, but the soul of it had been restored. Marcus Thorne, Ever the opportunist heard the shift. He saw the heads turning. His frantic energy immediately coalesced into a laser focus. This was something he could use. He strode over to the pianist as the boy finished the piece. "What was that? What did you do differently?" Marcus demanded in a harsh whisper. The young pianist, intimidated, could only stammer. I don't know. Someone. They changed the music." He pointed a trembling finger at the pencil marks on the page. A predatory gleam entered Marcus's eyes. He snatched the sheet music from the stand. He scanned it, pretending to understand the complex notation. He saw an opportunity not just to salvage the evening, but to elevate himself. He marched directly toward the table where Alastair Sterling sat with a group of international business partners. Alara watched in disbelief, a cold dread seeping into her bones. She knew what was about to happen. "Mr. Sterling, my apologies for the earlier lull," Marcus began, his voice oozing a false sincerity that made Alara's skin crawl. "Our featured artist was unfortunately taken ill. However, I've been personally overseeing our contingency plan." He held up the sheet music as if it were a holy relic. "I noticed a slight, shall we say, deficiency in the arrangement our backup was using. A bit pedestrian for an audience of this caliber." Sterling raised a skeptical eyebrow. He was a man who dealt in billions of dollars and complex logistics. He was not easily impressed by fluff. "So," Marcus continued, warming to his lie, "I took the liberty of making a small harmonic adjustment myself. A little revoicing of the chords in the bridge. Just a subtle touch to elevate the piece. I believe in attention to detail, you see. It's the little things that separate the good from the truly exceptional." He beamed, a proud peacock displaying stolen feathers. One of Sterling's guests, a German industrialist with a known passion for classical music, peered at the sheet music. "Remarkable," he murmured. "That is a very sophisticated bit of counterpoint. I wouldn't have expected it from a simple pop arrangement." Sterling looked at Marcus with a flicker of newfound respect. "Is that so, Marcus? I didn't know you had a musical background." "A few years of conservatory in my youth," Marcus lied smoothly. "One never truly forgets the fundamentals." He had stolen it. He had taken her tiny, anonymous act of beauty, her one small whisper of who she was, and claimed it as his own. He was being praised for it, rewarded. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. It was a perfect microcosm of her life, her talent, her knowledge, her very essence, rendered invisible and then plundered by men who had power she lacked. Working from the shadows was not enough. It would never be enough. Just then, her cheap, second-hand phone vibrated in her pocket. A text message. It was from Sarah, the social worker at the hospital who had become her only confidant. "Alara, Dr. Matthews just called. Leo's latest blood work is not good. His numbers are dropping faster than they expected. They need to make a decision on the surgery within 24 hours. We need confirmation of funding by tomorrow morning, or they'll have to move to palliative care." Palliative care. The two words echoed in the silent, screaming cavern of her mind. It was a clinical, sterile euphemism for giving up, for letting her brother die. The room began to spin. The glittering lights, the clinking glasses, the murmur of self-congratulatory chatter. It all faded into a nauseating blur. 24 hours. She had 24 hours to produce a miracle. The stolen melody, the lie Marcus was telling, it all seemed so trivial now, and yet so monstrously symbolic of the wall she was up against. She had to get out. She had to think. She stumbled back toward the service exit, her body trembling. But her movement caught Marcus's eye. His moment of triumph with Sterling had ended, and he was now basking in the glow of his perceived success. Seeing her again, the tattered girl he had dismissed earlier, reignited his petty cruelty. He clearly saw her as a loose thread in the perfect tapestry he was weaving. He intercepted her near the kitchen doors, his face a mask of fury. "I thought I told you to leave," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep. "Let go of me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You don't belong here," he snarled, his face close to hers. "You are a piece of trash that blew in off the street, and you are ruining my evening." He saw her backpack, a symbol of everything he despised about her. "What have you got in there? Stolen silverware? Guess wallets." He yanked the backpack from her shoulder. The contents spilled onto the floor, a mess of medical papers, a worn copy of The Little Prince she had been reading to Leo, the pencil stub, and the stale roll. And the locket. It had been in a side pocket, and the force of the fall sent it skittering across the marble. Marcus's eyes fixed on the small, tarnished piece of silver. He bent down and picked it up, his lip curling in a sneer. He fumbled it open, revealing the tiny photo of Julian and Isabella Vance. He didn't recognize them. He just saw a piece of cheap, old jewelry. "What is this junk?" he scoffed. "Give that back," Elara pleaded, her voice cracking. It was the last piece of her parents she had, the only tangible link to the life that had been stolen from her. "Please. It was my mother's." The plea only seemed to fuel his cruelty. A wicked idea formed in his mind. "No," he said slowly, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "I think I'll hold on to this. Consider it collateral. A security deposit to ensure that you get out of this building and never, ever come back." He slipped the locket into his tuxedo pocket. "Now get out before I have security throw you out." Something inside Elara snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, cold severance. The part of her that had been resigned, the part that had accepted her invisibility, the part that was willing to endure any humiliation for the sake of survival, it went silent. All that was left was a core of pure, unadulterated rage. And beneath the rage, a terrifying clarity. They had taken her home. They had taken her future. They had taken her music. This vile little man had just stolen the last remnant of her past. And now, the system he represented was about to take her brother. She had nothing left to lose. And a person with nothing left to lose is a person who is finally free. She looked past Marcus's smug face, toward the stage. The young pianist was gone, and an awkward silence had once again descended upon the room. Alastair Sterling was at the podium now, preparing to give his keynote address. He looked annoyed, tapping the microphone and glancing toward Marcus with an expression of deep impatience. "Marcus," Sterling's voice boomed through the sound system, amplified for all to hear. "You assured me the entertainment was handled. This prolonged silence is embarrassing. It's unprofessional." Marcus froze, the color draining from his face. The billionaire's public rebuke was a death sentence in this world. He shot Elara a look of pure hatred, as if she were somehow responsible for this new failure. He started to stammer an excuse into his headset, turning his back on her to scurry toward the stage. This was the moment. The closing doors of the elevator, the final note of the symphony, the last chance before the end. Elara straightened her back. She walked out from the shadows of the service corridor and into the light. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She walked with a purpose that made people turn and look. A security guard moved to intercept her, his hand outstretched. But her voice, when it came, was not the whisper of a beggar. It was clear, resonant, and filled with an authority that stunned the guard into stillness. It cut through the awkward murmuring of the crowd like a diamond cutting glass. "The entertainment is lacking," she announced, her voice carrying across the entire ballroom, "because the instrument is unworthy of being played." A collective gasp went through the room. All eyes were on her. Alastair Sterling paused at the podium, his expression a mixture of shock and intrigue. Marcus spun around, his face a grotesque mask of horror and disbelief. "The piano," Elara continued, her gaze fixed on Sterling, ignoring the furious sputtering of the event coordinator. "That Fazioli. It's out of tune. The B-flat above middle C is flat by at least 5 cents. And the piece your musician was attempting to play is a butcher's arrangement, an insult to the composer and an insult to this audience." "Security," Marcus finally shrieked, finding his voice. "Get this lunatic out of here. Get her out now." 2 large guards began to advance on her, but Sterling held up a hand. The gesture was small, but it carried the absolute authority of a man who owned the building and everyone in it. The guard stopped instantly. "Wait," Sterling said, his eyes narrowed, studying Elara with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time all night. "Let her speak." Elara took a deep breath, the air tasting of vindication. She looked directly at the most powerful man in the room, and for the first time in 2 years, she did not feel small. "My name is Elara Vance," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she thought she had lost forever. "My parents were Julian and Isabella Vance." A ripple of recognition went through the older members of the audience. Murmurs spread through the crowd. The Vances, the brilliant pianists. Lost too soon. Sterling's eyes widened slightly. He remembered the name. He had been an admirer of their work. Before I was forced to leave my studies to care for my family, Elara continued, her voice gaining strength. I was a scholarship student at the Juilliard School. She then turned and pointed a single, trembling finger directly at Marcus Thorne. The man standing over there, the man who just claimed to have rewritten that music, is a fraud. He is a liar and a thief. He wouldn't know a diatonic scale from a dinner bell. Marcus looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He opened his mouth, but only a strangled squeak came out. Elara turned away from him, her focus entirely on the stage, on the magnificent instrument that had been waiting for her all her life. You want entertainment, Mr. Sterling? You want to hear music? Her voice dropped to a dramatic, compelling hush. I will give you music. She walked to the stage, and this time, no one dared to stop her. The crowd parted for her, as if she were royalty. She ascended the small set of stairs and approached the piano. She ran a hand over the polished fallboard, a reunion with a long-lost friend. She sat on the bench, adjusting it slightly. The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect, breathless vacuum of anticipation. Every eye was on the homeless girl who spoke with the authority of a queen. She took a moment, closed her eyes, and thought of Leo. She thought of his frail hand in hers, of his whispered question from the night before. Will I get to hear you play the piano again, Elara? Yes, Leo, she whispered to herself. Yes, you will. Her hands rose over the keys. She did not begin with a gentle prelude or a simple melody to warm up. She began with an explosion. The opening chords of Liszt's La Campanella erupted from the piano, a torrent of sound that was shocking in its power and complexity. It was one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written for the piano, a dizzying display of rapid octaves, treacherous leaps, and lightning-fast trills. It was not just a performance, it was a declaration. Her fingers, which Marcus had seen as dirty and unworthy, flew across the keyboard with a speed and precision that seemed supernatural. The music poured out of her, a lifetime of suppressed passion, grief, and rage unleashed in a furious, brilliant cascade of notes. The melody, the little bell of the title, chimed with crystalline clarity amidst the thundering complexity of the accompaniment. She was not merely playing the piece. She was inhabiting it, wrestling with it, conquering it. The crowd was mesmerized. Jaws were literally agape. The German industrialist who had praised Marcus's sophisticated correction was now pale, shaking his head in silent, awestruck disbelief. Alistair Sterling stood frozen behind the podium, his planned speech completely forgotten. Marcus Thorne had shrunk, his face a ghastly shade of white, the sweat beading on his forehead. He was witnessing the public execution of his own credibility. The final section of the piece was a breathtaking race to the finish line, a flurry of notes that seemed to defy the physical limitations of human hands. Elara played it with a fierce, joyful abandon, a smile finally touching her lips. As the final, triumphant chord echoed through the magnificent hall, she held it, letting the sound hang in the air, rich and resonant. Then, silence. For a full 5 seconds, the room was utterly still. Then, a single person began to clap. It was followed by another, and another, until the entire room erupted in a thunderous, spontaneous standing ovation. It was not polite applause. It was a roar of approval, of astonishment, of pure, unadulterated awe. Elara stood up from the piano bench, her body trembling with adrenaline and emotion. She bowed, not with the deference of a servant, but with the grace and confidence of a seasoned concert artist. She scanned the crowd, her eyes finally landing on the pathetic, sweating figure of Marcus Thorne. She raised her voice, clear and cold, over the din of the applause. And now, she said, the ovation instantly ceasing as everyone strained to hear her next words. I would like my property back. All heads swiveled to look at Marcus. He was trapped in a spotlight of shame, 100 pairs of eyes boring into him. Alistair Sterling stepped down from the podium, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. He walked directly to Marcus, his movements slow and deliberate. Marcus, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Is this true? Did you take something from this young woman? No. Mr. Sterling, she's lying. She's a vagrant, a crazy person who, Marcus stammered, his lies crumbling into incoherent babble. But he was not saved. From the side of the room, a small voice piped up. It was the young waitress Marcus had viciously berated earlier. "I saw him, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I saw him take her necklace. He put it in his pocket." That was all Sterling needed to hear. He turned to Marcus, his eyes like chips of ice. "Empty your pockets." Now, Marcus hesitated, his entire body trembling. "I will not ask you again," Sterling said, the threat hanging unspoken in the air. With fumbling, defeated fingers, Marcus reached into his tuxedo pocket. He pulled out a handkerchief, a pen, and finally, the small, tarnished silver locket. It glinted under the chandelier light, a tiny beacon of truth. Sterling didn't even look at it. He snapped his fingers, and the two security guards who had earlier advanced on Alara now converged on Marcus. "Escort Mr. Thorne from the premises. He is no longer employed by this foundation, or any of my companies. See to it that he is blacklisted from every event management firm in this city. I want his professional life to be over by sunrise." As the guards took Marcus by the arms, Sterling added one final, chilling instruction. "And make sure you have him return the locket to its rightful owner on his way out." One of the guards gently took the locket from Marcus's limp hand and walked it over to Alara, offering it to her with a respectful nod. Marcus Thorne was then dragged away, his protests dissolving into pathetic whimpers, a petty tyrant erased from the story he had tried so desperately to control. Alara took the locket, her fingers closing around the cool metal. The relief was a tidal wave, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. It was over. The humiliation, the fear, the invisibility, it was all over. Alistair Sterling approached her, his expression a complex mixture of awe, admiration, and profound regret. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice filled with a genuine humility she had not thought a man like him capable of. I have no words. That was not merely a performance. That was a miracle. It was the single most incredible display of talent I have ever had the privilege to witness in my life." He paused, seeming to struggle for the right words. "The mission of this foundation is to alleviate suffering and to foster human potential. Tonight, I have seen that we have been failing. We have been building walls instead of bridges." He looked her directly in the eye. "Whatever your brother needs, the surgery, the aftercare, the best doctors in the world, consider it done. My foundation will cover every single cent. There is no need to even discuss it further. It is the absolute least I can do to atone for how you were treated here tonight." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, tears of gratitude so immense they felt like they could wash the whole world clean. Leo was going to be okay. He was going to live. The two words she had been chasing for 6 agonizing months, the words that had seemed impossible, were now a reality. It's done. She clutched her locket, the tangible proof of her victory, and took a deep, steadying breath. But the timid, frightened girl who had entered this ballroom hours ago was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who understood her own value. The wave of relief was followed by a steely resolve. Solving her own problem was no longer enough. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice steady and strong. "For my brother, I am more grateful than I can ever say. But this was never just about him." She gestured around the opulent room, at the well-dressed guests who were still watching her with rapt attention. "Your foundation gives millions of dollars to institutions. But what about the individuals? What about the talent that doesn't have a diploma or a recommendation? The brilliance that is hidden by poverty and misfortune?" She took a step closer to him, her gaze unwavering. "How many others like me have been turned away from these doors? How many potential geniuses are sleeping on your city's streets tonight, their gifts slowly dying inside them because they can't get past a gatekeeper like Marcus Thorne? You have the power to do more than just sign checks, Mr. Sterling. You have the power to find them." Sterling listened, his expression unreadable but intensely focused. He wasn't offended by her audacity. He was captivated by it. This was the language he understood, not begging, but strategy. Not problems, but solutions. "I'm listening," he said. "Create a new initiative," she proposed, the idea coming to her fully formed, a symphony of purpose. "A program dedicated to finding and funding these hidden gems. Don't wait for them to find you. Go to them. Go to the shelters, the community centers, the free clinics. Create a new way for people to be seen, a way that judges them on their talent and their character, not on their clothes or their address. Let me run it. I know where to look, because I have been there. A slow smile spread across Alistair Sterling's face. It was a smile of genuine excitement, the smile of a man who has just discovered a new, thrilling venture. Miss Vance, he said, extending his hand. I believe you are the best investment I will ever make. You're hired. Name your price, and give your new department a name. Alara looked down at the locket in her hand, at the memory of her parents. She knew what it would be called. The Vance Initiative, she said, shaking his hand firmly. And my price is that we start tomorrow. 6 months later, Alara Vance sat in an office with a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. The desk was made of polished cherry wood, but it was not cluttered with corporate trinkets. It was covered in files, each one representing a life, a dream, a spark of talent waiting for a chance to ignite. She wore a simple but elegant blazer, and around her neck, gleaming and polished, hung her silver locket. It was no longer a relic of a lost past, but a symbol of a reclaimed future. On the corner of her desk was a silver-framed photograph. It showed a boy of about 8, his face bright with health and laughter, sitting at a brand-new piano in a sun-drenched apartment. Leo. He had made a full recovery. He was taking lessons now, and to no one's surprise, he was a natural. The Vance legacy would continue. Alara was no longer Alara Vance, the homeless girl. She was Director Vance, the head of the Sterling Foundation's most innovative and successful new department, the Vance Initiative for Emerging Talent. Her days were a whirlwind of activity. She had assembled a small, dedicated team, including the young waitress from the gala, who was now her sharp and efficient administrative assistant. They didn't sit in their ivory tower. They were on the ground, visiting homeless shelters, public schools in underserved neighborhoods, and community arts programs. They had thrown out the old, cumbersome grant application process and replaced it with a system based on auditions, interviews, and potential. She picked up the top file on her desk. It was an application from a young woman in the Bronx who had developed a revolutionary water purification system in her basement. The girl was a high school dropout, but her scientific mind was brilliant. Alara stamped the file with a large, satisfying approved and moved on to the next. It was a portfolio from a graphic artist who had been working as a janitor, his incredible designs sketched on napkins during his breaks. Approved. Next was a business plan for a catering company from a woman in a shelter who cooked magnificent meals using only the ingredients from the food pantry. Approved. This was her new music. The harmony of potential meeting opportunity. The crescendo of a life turned around. The Sterling Foundation, once a symbol of the indifferent barrier between the rich and the poor, was becoming a true force for change, all because one woman had refused to remain invisible. Far across town, a man in a stained, ill-fitting parking attendant's uniform directed a luxury sedan into a tight space. It was Marcus Thorne. His face was sallow, his posture stooped. The arrogance had been scraped out of him, leaving behind only a hollow shell of bitterness. He had been thoroughly and systematically blacklisted, just as Sterling had promised. No one would hire him. This dead-end job was all he could find. As the sedan pulled away, his eyes fell upon a poster on the wall of the parking garage. It was an advertisement for the first annual Vance Initiative Showcase, a gala celebrating the program's first class of recipients. And there, in the center of the poster, was a photograph of Alara. She was seated at the Fazioli grand piano, looking directly at the camera with an expression of serene confidence and power. She looked magnificent, regal. A wave of impotent rage and self-pity washed over him. He saw her, but she was a million miles away, in a world he could no longer access. He was the ghost now, the invisible man. A car horn blared impatiently behind him. Someone wanted to park. Marcus flinched, turned away from the poster, and scurried to do his job, a forgotten footnote in a story that was now, finally, Alara's.